Hello, welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's 12 days to go before Election Day, and this is your countdown. Welcome again. You're watching Decision 2018 Countdown. So every day, Mondays through Thursdays, leading up to the election, we're inviting various guests to talk about different topics. Election, government issues, the candidates themselves, the campaigns. Today we have Mr. Lawrence Boschulte. You probably know him from the election system, but also I'm going to talk to you about his shows later on. Apparently he has like 3 radio shows, which we're going to talk about. But make sure you tune in to Decision 2018 Countdown leading up to the election. So we're going to have this going until next week, and then we're going to have a general election day the week after next. So keep tuning in, and we hope that you're more informed as you go to the polls on November 6th. So let's go to Mr. Boschulte. This is his first time on Decision 2018 Countdown.
Hopefully
He's
not
a
the
former...
last.
Huh?
Hopefully not the last.
Hopefully not the last. Well, we hope to keep this going, so maybe in future shows we can have you back.
Okay.
But Mr. Boschulte is a former election board member.
16 years.
16 years, wow.
Yeah.
And the last election that you kind of presided over was
2 years ago.
2 years ago,
Yeah.
The 2016 one.
Yes.
Yeah. So he was a former election board member. He's also a former St. Thomas and Water Island administrator under the MAP administration. I think he came on board on 2015, correct?
Correct.
Was it December 20?
I left November.
November, the following year?
No, the same year.
The same year?
Yeah, so I only was there 10 to 11 months.
Okay, so you were installed like beginning of 2016?
January 5th, I think it was.
Right. Okay, so roughly a year as St. Thomas and Water Island administrator. He's also, as I mentioned before, a talk show host. He has 3 programs, and let me tell you about them. They air on 90.9 FM.
Correct.
One of them is Just Us, 12 to 2 on Saturdays, and then Just Kwelbe and Fungi.
Music, yes.
Purely music, 1 to 2 on Sundays, and then Just Government, which is perfect, and this is why we have him with us. Just Government at 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. on Mondays and Tuesdays.
Correct.
So those 3 shows, make sure you watch out for them on 90.9 FM.
And then if they can't get 90.9 FM, it's www.cbnvirginislands.com.
Okay, great. So let's get right to it. Our first topic is voter engagement. Mr. Boschulte has been with the election board for 16 years, so we are pretty eager to hear what his insights are. Now, one of the things I want to hear from you is, what do you think is different between this gubernatorial election and the one in 2014, 4 years ago, in terms of the smoothness of the process for voters? Did you vote yet? Early voting?
No, I'm going to do early voting this weekend.
Okay, but from your observations, and I'm sure you kind of get a sense of this, what's different in 2014, which I remember was kind of chaotic, and this year?
Well, I think the main thing is people are trusting it more. It was the first time they were doing early voting. There's 2 different machines now, the paper ballot and also the one that's like an ATM machine. So I think people feel more comfortable. There's still those doubters out in the public that you'll always find. But because this one is longer too, remember 2014 there was a situation with the Chucky Hansen that had stopped the early voting for a few days. So with this, and people know it's long, and what they've been through the last 3+ years, especially the hurricanes and different things like that, I think people want to get out and vote because the Board of Elections are doing a heck of a job. You look at the numbers, it's incredible.
Right, absolutely. And you remember in 2014, I think that was the first time that the DS200s were being used.
Yes, and that's what I'm saying. They were kind of skeptical. People were like, what? What's this new machine? And that's how people are. They're always, if they're not comfortable in something, they're hesitant. But then remember 2 years ago, there was another election.
Right.
So then they had early voting back then also. So 2 years ago, they felt a little more comfortable. You had less people talking bad about the machines. And you still had those doubters as you have now, but at least they feel a little more comfortable.
And I think you will always have those people, you know, who will, they're not, everything that the election board or the election system does, and I think there are segments of the community who immediately distrust, how the election board and the election system go about.
I think that was the only problem I had being on the board is not having enough individuals that would step out and try and knock down all the negativity. Sometimes we have some of the board members like, oh, well, let them talk. And it's like, yeah, but then when one talks negative, somebody hears it and then they believe it. They hear it. You listen to the radio shows, you're like, so many people call in and are negative, but nobody calls back from the board or the supervisor to talk about it, to quiet it down a little bit.
And that's just the talk.
Yeah.
You also have people actually reporting things to the FBI to, you know, investigate the workings of the election board and the election system.
True, and I always say that being there for the 16 years, never once have an FBI agent interviewed me.
Right.
Never once. Never pulled me aside, asked me for a private meeting. The only meeting that I did have was when they had the investigation in 2012.
Right.
And I was interviewed twice at the Department of Justice, and nothing still didn't come out of it. And I have no problem in going back because I didn't see any problems in 2012. But you always hear the different
Ballots missing,
the three different
things like that.
the three different M's that complain about it, but don't have a concrete evidence of what was missing.
Right. Okay. So let's go to this year's numbers in terms of registered voters. Now, election supervisor Carolyn Fox did a great job this year in terms of surpassing her goal of registering 50,000 voters. I think she's at more than 51,000.
Yeah, 51 plus, correct.
51,000 plus voters. And there seems to be a heightened sense of civic duty this election. Now, one could say that's because this is a gubernatorial year as opposed to midterms. But how much of that is attributed to this being a gubernatorial year versus general dissatisfaction with the current administration?
I think it's both, and then also we have to include that we didn't purge. Remember, a law was passed stating that they can no longer purge voters.
Right.
Before we purged on an average close to 3,000 voters every election. After the election surpassed,
Mainly because
they haven't voted in 2 general elections.
Right.
So there was a law that was passed through the Senate saying no longer purge, and you will be a registered voter no matter how long it is now.
Right.
So because of that, that's what created now that it didn't drop. So if you dropped 3,000, it would have been less than 51. It would have been closer to 48.
Yeah.
But because they didn't have to purge those 3,000, it kept it in the ballpark of only going up. You'll never go down from now on.
And what is your opinion on that, not purging voters because they were inactive in the last 2 general elections?
I actually don't have a problem with purging voters. I have a few board members that have a problem with it, saying, oh, you should all, but it's hard to do different polls. It's hard to get a satisfaction in the amount of registered voters, because some might pass away that you're not 100% sure that you're going to take off.
Right.
Some of them might have moved away, so they're no longer, while they're on the voting polls, they're away. They moved away, whether, especially now that we had the 2 storms, while it's 51,000, it might be 45, because some of the thousands of people that left the island. So it's not, to me, it's not a consistent number. It's that you see 51, you're like, oh wow, 51, but then you have to understand some of those voters don't care about voting. So how do you judge that? How do you judge 5,000 or 7,000 people that's just not going to go?
And then in the States, they're having these issues with the exact matches of the IDs when you're registering to vote. Is that a problem down here?
No, I think when I go to the States to the different classes, because I'm a CERA trained election official, and I ask individuals in the States, when they register in the States, they don't have picture IDs. We're one of the only jurisdictions that started with picture IDs. So in our eyes, we were looking at it like, oh, it's cool, because a lot of locals like the ID that they could cash checks or different things like that.
Right.
While in the States, they looked at it different. They're like, why do I have to bring an ID? Why do I have to take a picture ID?
Right.
Two things with that. It's easier to register people in the States without the ID, because you can go, and the Democrats and the Republicans go to their different districts and register people, while in the Virgin Islands, you have to come to the Board of Elections to register one, and if there's a voter outreach, there must be a Democrat and a Republican at the same time. You just can't go all Republicans come in and say, okay, all these people are registered voters, or the Democrats come and say, all these people are registered voters.
Right.
It must be a voter outreach has to have a Democrat, a Republican, or no party and a Republican, or no party and a Democrat. It must have 2 different board members.
Wow, and that's a major difference between us.
Yeah, than the States, correct.
And it makes a lot of difference
Correct.
in terms of having.
Well, to me, it's more secure. When you see that somebody's a registered voter, they're guaranteed a registered voter. In my eyes, when I talk to different registration officials in the states, like the different supervisors, like Ms. Fox in the states. I'm like, you do what? You mean the Republicans can go and pick 100 people in the supermarket and then they bring you the paper and now they're registered? How does that work? So, I'm kind of, when I heard that, I was like, okay. I'm just glad how our system is set up.
Yes, it's an advantage for us.
Guaranteed that when you're a registered voter, you're a registered voter.
Wonderful. We'll be right back on Decision 2018 Countdown. More with Mr. Lawrence Boschulte. Welcome back. You're watching Decision 2018 Countdown. 12 days to go before Election Day. We're here with Mr. Larry Boschulte, and he's talking to us about different topics because of his experience with the Board of Elections. He was there for 16 years. He also has a few radio shows that still allow him to get into the discussion.
Keep in the mix.
Keep it in the mix, discussing issues in the government. As I said, he was in the election board for a long time, and this segment is actually about that. Now, Mr. Boschulte, I want to know, the election board is instrumental in deciding a lot of things that affect voters, such as, I think that you decide whether a vote counts when a bubble is incompletely shaded. I think that was an issue back when people were shading ballots, and then
the first election, which was 2014, only because people wasn't used to it. They wasn't what to do, and they didn't understand
the machine.
Correct.
You mean like shading in the bubble and then they having to feed into the machine.
Correct. And then some was X's and then so different things like that. So we had to explain it. It was more of an education.
Right. So I mean, you get your share of criticism. I was in those board meetings, and people would stand up and just tell you to your face what they think of you.
True.
That makes it a little more exciting. But I think there's also a misconception or a lack of understanding on the role of the Board of Elections versus the role of the election system, which executes the policies, right?
Correct.
Talk a little bit about that. What's the difference between those two?
Well, the main thing is the Board of Elections sets the policy, and the election system, which is a supervisor, carries it out. The election supervisor, I would say she takes a lot of criticism herself, but she has to report to the board.
Right.
So
and she takes criticism from the public,
both sides,
and the board.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, so, and it varies, and I feel for her sometimes because it's not really her. She has to walk that fine line.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll go back to her predecessor, Mr. Abramson. And Mr. Abramson and I didn't see eye to eye.
Right.
But I would say that
Mr. Abramson didn't see eye to eye with
Mr. Abramson, I got to admit, though, if you better know the code. If you come against Mr. Abramson, you better read that code.
Because he knows it.
Because he knows the code back and front. So that's one thing about Mr. Abramson that I always talk about when people, we weren't the greatest of friends, but if you come after him, you better make sure you know the code because he knows the code as well.
But it's almost always Mr. Abramson and Mr. Watlington,
that's
also who's a lawyer and who also knows.
And also Bert Bryant. So it was those three, and sometimes Bert would be on Mr. Watlington's side, which isn't quite often, but then sometimes Mr. Abramson would be against both sides, so it was back and forth. Yeah.
So let me ask you, I've covered quite a few Board of Election meetings, and I gotta tell you, this is like my honest to God experience when I first started as a reporter on St. Thomas. One of the first stories that I covered was a Board of Elections meeting. It was 6 hours of just bickering, back and forth, and maybe like 2 hours of mission accomplished on some of the things in your agenda. What are the things that you think the Board of Elections can improve? I know there's new blood right now.
The main thing is what you just said.
Right.
I think actually communication, and not mostly in the 7 in each district, but between districts.
Right.
I think the districts, just like the people on the island, have a problem with each other. Sometimes you find St. Thomians have a problem with Crucians have a problem with St. Thomian. It's the same thing on the board. My experience for the 16 years, there was always St. Croix against St. Thomas.
Wow.
So when you came to that board meeting, it probably was a joint board meeting.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It was. And there were a few joint board meetings where Crucians just didn't fly in. It decided not to come.
True. And sometimes then because of that, it was like, kids in high school. I'm not going to theirs. Since they didn't come to ours, then we're
So
not
St.
going to
Thomas
theirs.
won't go to
So
the
that's
joint
how,
board
yeah, correct.
and
I think the best thing what they're trying to do now is teleconference. That might work, but then it's hard with this communication and internet, and then the meetings can.
And I think some things get lost in translation too when you're talking to a.
True. And then the problem with telecommunications, because of the code, it says that you were supposed to be present. If you're going to have a telecommunication with islands, then what's the problem with somebody being away?
Right. Off island.
Off
away
island, like
from
in
the
America.
territory.
Yeah. In America or even in the Eastern Caribbean, how can you stop that person now? Because then that would be a beef of somebody else saying, oh, well, why can't I be part of it? You're not in the room with the others.
Well, wasn't there that issue before where somebody, I think, was on the phone and was able to vote on an issue?
It was a big issue, and then it hung up, and they got hung up on, and then it was back and forth, and some board members felt like, no, they shouldn't vote because they're not here. And the one, of course, the one that's not here is going to say, I should vote because I'm calling in. You know it's me. But of course, one of the board members like, I can't prove it's you.
Right.
So that was one of the problems.
Which is kind of a legitimate concern, huh?
True. Yeah, you can look at it both ways.
I mean, you know the person's voice, but then, you know, later in terms of documentation, you don't know.
Of them signing, correct.
Yeah,
correct.
right. Okay, so last question on the current board. There are a lot of new members from since you were there, I believe. And then there were members of the public who wanted to get in the board that finally got in. Ms. Mercer, Ms. McGrath, I believe, got in. And then we have Javon Williams on St. Croix, Max Schanfarber on St. Croix.
No, he's on St. Thomas.
St. Thomas. So, and two representing the Republican Party.
And Mercer is on St. Thomas.
And Harriet Mercer on St. Thomas. How much of a difference, just very quickly, how much of a difference does new blood make in the Board of Elections?
I think it might make a little difference, but when you have a core of 4 that's been there before, which is Watlington, Wells, Hendricks, and now the new one. When you have a majority of 4, you don't care how many new come on. 3 new ones coming on doesn't change anything.
But the joint board is supposed to be how many members?
8. Well, it's 14 total, but 8. All you need is 8. So as long as you get 4 in St. Thomas and you get your 4 in St. Croix, in the St. Croix district, you got your 8. And that controls the board. 8 votes.
Oh, wow. All right, so we're going to have more from Mr. Boschulte later when we return. You're watching Decision 2018 Countdown. We'll be right back. Welcome back. You're watching Decision 2018 Countdown. 12 days to go before Election Day. We're here with Mr. Larry Boschulte, former election board member, as well as former St. Thomas St.
John administrator.
St. Thomas and Water Island administrator. Now, related to that, you came on board. I know you were only there for a year, but also you have a show called Just Government where you talk about different issues. Now, combining those two experiences, what would you say, while you were St. Thomas Water Island administrator, were the biggest problems that came before you?
I would say some of the same things right now, which is the trash. A lot of people called about trash. They called about sewage. I mean, the administrator, to me, being there is just a glorified position. You have no budget.
So what kind of power do you have?
Nothing really.
No.
Yeah, you really don't, because when you try to solve some of the problems, and it might have changed. I can only speak for what I went through.
When you were.
And when you try to talk to some of the commissioners, or you try to go ahead and do the job, the commissioner's like, look, you're in my property. Don't be messing with my stuff. So you would have, it's like a stickle effect. You have the people calling, complaining, but then you have to be careful when you talk to the different commissioners because
And you don't have your own budget.
And you don't have a budget because if you go to the government house to say, okay, let's fix this, they're like, psh, no, we're not fixing that.
Go to this department.
Yeah, we're like, they're like, no, that's not our priority. So
why are you there?
I agree. It's one of those glorified positions that just you get paid for working with a campaign.
Why did you resign?
The main reason was that me and the senior policy advisor, we weren't getting along.
And who was that at the time?
It's currently the same one. The senior policy advisor is Frankie Johnson.
Okay.
So we weren't seeing eye to eye. A lot of people think that the administrators report to the governor. That's not true. There was a new creation of a position, which was a senior policy advisor. Frankie Johnson got that position, and then I had to report to him. And he didn't choose me. The governor chose me. So we didn't really. While I thought we were close, it started to deteriorate when he would ask for certain things, and he felt that I was closer to the chief of staff, Randy Knight,
Yeah, at the time.
and Randy Knight and him wasn't the best of friends. So it goes back to something like what we're talking about on the board. If people don't get along, they let it spill over to others.
Do you think this is particular to this administration, or it's endemic? Do you think
It's probably endemic because I wasn't working with any previous administrations.
Right.
And the last administration I worked with was under DeYoung, and under DeYoung I was a contract worker with tourism, so I really didn't have to see the day-to-day operations. I did my contract work and that's it. But I think in government there's too many egos, whether it was like when I was on the board or whether it was at the administrator job, because if you have a senior policy advisor, I don't understand why you didn't like the chief of staff. The chief of staff, Randy Knight, wasn't the easiest person to get along with, but I didn't have a problem with him.
And then I was going to ask you which of those problems still exist. You mentioned the trash problem, which until now seems to be, for some people, getting worse.
Yeah.
I think there was the removal of the trash bins from certain areas.
Yeah, because
happened.
and less, well, the waste management doesn't provide as much service as they should.
Even with, I believe it's a $25 million budget,
Correct.
something like
Correct.
that.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, what problems do you think the next administration should focus on, whether, and when I say next administration, the next 4 years? It could
No,
be
I agree with you with the next administration that will be coming in, whoever it is, as long as it's not this current one. I think the main thing is the retirement system, because a lot of people, whether you're young or you're old, are tied to the retirement system. Whether you're a private business or you're in government, you're tied to the retirement system. So I think that's the main thing. After that, then they have to look at the different issues that affect the day-to-day people.
And then as for the GRS, you know, there were different solutions being bandied about. I think that one of those was Diasi Kofelt was suggesting just borrowing the money outright, the amount of the unfunded liability from Treasury.
And then Governor candidate Moser was saying kind of the opposite, like pay everybody off, pay them there and let them go. So it's going to take a lot. It takes sitting down with the board, and the board's been there a long time. Let them hash it out. I think my only problem is when you have a governor that says pack a lunch instead of sitting down with the individuals to try and solve it is a different issue.
Wonderful. Okay, so that's all the time we have. I wish we could still continue to talk about all these things. Maybe you can have me on one of your shows.
Anytime.
Yeah. So don't forget his shows, Just Us 12 to 2 on Saturdays, Just Kwelbe and Fungi 1 to 2 on Sundays, and Just Government 7 to 8 p.m. Mondays and Tuesdays on 90.9. This is Decision 28 Countdown, 12 days to go before Election Day, and we were here tonight with Mr. Larry Boschulte. Make sure you tune in next week, Monday, 7 p.m. for the next episode. Thank you very much for watching.